Hey, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us on Facebook and YouTube. This morning we are continuing our class, I Object, Why Some People Disbelieve. And today's question might be another one that surprises you. Doesn't religion hinder morality? Basically, the idea is this. Some people who are anti-religion argue that religious belief makes people do terrible things in the name of religion. And today's class will look at whether or not this is a fair assessment of all religious belief. And I think we'll see this idea that religious belief hinders morality doesn't really hold up. In 2018, Nadia Murad published her memoirs entitled The Last Girl, My Story of Captivity and My Fight Against the Islamic State. Nadia was born and raised in Kocho, a small village of farmers and shepherds in northern Iraq. She grew up in the Yazidi community, and she and her brothers and sisters lived a fairly quiet life. She had dreams of becoming a history teacher, maybe opening her own beauty salon one day. But on August 15th, 2014, when Nadia was just 21 years old, that life ended. Islamic State militants massacred the people of her village, executing men who refused to convert to Islam and executing women who were too old to become sex slaves. 6 of Nadia's brothers were killed, and eventually her mother. Their bodies swept into mass graves. Nadia was later taken to Mosul, a city in northern Iraq, and forced, along with thousands of other Yazidi girls, into the ISIS slave trade. At the slave market, she was bought by a judge who already had 3 other girls he used as sex slaves. One day the judge told Nadia, "You are my 4th slave. The other 3 are Muslim now. I did that for them. Yazidis are infidels. That's why we're doing this. It's to help you." After being repeatedly raped and beaten, Nadia managed to narrowly escape to the streets of Mosul and eventually found shelter in the home of a Muslim family that wanted nothing to do with ISIS. That family's eldest son risked his life smuggling Nadia to safety. Today, Nadia Murad is a human rights activist and winner of the Nobel Peace Prize. She and several others are currently working to bring the Islamic State before the International Criminal Court on charges of genocide and crimes against humanity. She's also the founder of a program called Nadia's Initiative, which is dedicated to helping survivors of genocide and human trafficking to heal and rebuild their communities. When I first heard about Nadia's story, I was horrified, but not altogether surprised. As a history major, I knew all about the Assyrians, whose capital was Nineveh, the ancient city whose ruins lie right across the river from Mosul, Iraq. We read about the Assyrians in the Old Testament. They were legendary for their forms of torture and even decorated their palaces with wall carvings depicting how they destroyed the Israelite city of Lachish and horrifically murdered and enslaved its citizens in 701 BC. What ISIS did a few years ago has been happening in that part of the world for literally thousands of years. When we hear Nadia Murad's account, we naturally think to ourselves, how can people commit such unimaginable evil? One of the sad truths of that situation is that those who committed these atrocities thought they were doing good. The judge told Nadia she was an infidel and indicated he would force her one way or another to become Muslim for her benefit. Now, according to a pamphlet published by ISIS titled Questions and Answers on Taking Captives and Slaves, it was religiously acceptable for ISIS militants to take female sex slaves. This 2015 article from the Human Rights Watch explains how ISIS terrorists justified treating non-Muslim women as sexual property, which egregiously disregards almost universal laws against slavery and rape. Nadia Murad is a Yazidi, an ethnic and religious minority from northern Iraq. And according to ISIS, she was the legitimate target for slavery because she was considered, quote, merely property. ISIS's laws also allowed for pedophilia, according to this graphic that I have on the screen right here. Many aggressively anti-religion atheists today will point to the kinds of horrific abuses perpetrated by ISIS and other religiously affiliated fanatical or terrorist groups. And they'll say things like, look, this is what religion does to people. This is what religious belief can lead people to do. This is basically what one Nobel Prize-winning physicist, Steven Weinberg, said in 1999. Religion is an insult to human dignity. With or without it, you would have good people doing good things and evil people doing evil things. But for good people to do evil things, that takes religion. Now, for him to win a Nobel Prize in physics, I think it's reasonable to assume that Weinberg is perfectly capable of making carefully crafted and nuanced arguments that account for complexity in the details. So when he says things like, but for good people to do evil things, that takes religion, this kind of blanket statement is just surprisingly foolish and actually raises several problems. First of all, how does he even define good and evil? How can he determine what's good and what's evil without an absolute basis for distinguishing between good and evil? We're going to see later that this is the major problem many atheists face when they try to argue that there is such a thing as universal morals. Atheistic secular humanism doesn't provide the philosophical foundation for universal human rights like many atheistic secular humanists think it does. Second, this claim that it takes religion for good people to do evil things just doesn't fit the data, something you'd think a physicist like Steven Weinberg would appreciate. In 2018, Wake Forest philosophy professor Christian Miller published a book titled The Character Gap, How Good Are We? And there he refers to the literally hundreds of studies linking religious participation and better moral behavior. A number of different academic studies from the past 30 years report lower rates of domestic abuse among those who regularly attend church once a week or more. In 2007, public policy expert Arthur Brooks published his study on which factors were most influential in determining if someone gave to charity, and the results may or may not surprise you. Strong families and church attendance were good indicators that you would regularly give to charity. Atheist social psychologist Jonathan Haidt, whom we quoted from a couple of weeks ago, he published an essay in 2007 looking at the health benefits of religion. Haidt identifies as a secular liberal. So it's especially interesting when he says this, and also refers to some stuff that Arthur Brooks did as well. Haidt says, religious believers give more money than secular folk to secular charities and to their neighbors. They give more of their time, too, and of their blood, even if you excuse secular liberals from charity because they vote for government welfare programs. It is awfully hard to explain why secular liberals give so little blood. The bottom line, Brooks concludes, is that all forms of giving go together and are greatly increased by religious participation. Third, when you say it takes religion for good people to do evil things, religion is such a huge umbrella term, it's hard to even know what we're talking about. Religion covers things as vastly different as ISIS and the Amish, or Buddhist non-violence and pagan child sacrifice. Again, we can look to atheist Jonathan Haidt, who brings a little bit of clarity when people like Steven Weinberg or the new atheists, whom I mentioned a couple weeks ago, when these guys try to muddy the waters by denouncing religion. Here in his essay, Moral Psychology and the Misunderstanding of Religion, Jonathan Haidt says, whether the net effects of religion for humanity are good or bad is a complex empirical question, the answer to which varies by religion, by era, and by what terms we include in our cost-benefit analysis. This is exactly the sort of ambiguous data set from which it is so easy to cherry-pick evidence in favor of one's desired conclusion. Basically, Haidt is affirming this idea that religion is such a huge term that if we say religion is good or religion is bad, that is so ambiguous that we can just find examples that we want without having to look at the whole thing. The fourth problem with saying it takes religion for good people to do evil things brings up the question of universal human rights. And if we're going to talk about religion and universal human rights, then I think it's important that we take a look at the world into which Christianity first emerged. Now, this idea of universal human rights is hardly common in the ancient world. The Gospels first spread through the Greek and Roman world, and when we consider what kind of rights people typically believed in, we see the following things. Men were almost universally more free than women and children. Slavery was universal, and it was common for girls to be sold into prostitution. Baby boys were often more valued than girls. Archaeologists have found a letter in a ancient trash pile in Egypt, and this letter is from a husband who leaves home to find work. fairly soon after he leaves, he writes to his pregnant wife to tell him that if the baby is a boy, the wife needs to keep the baby boy, but if the baby is a girl, the wife needs to throw her out, expose her, basically kill the baby girl. If newborns were sickly or disabled, they were routinely discarded, left out in trash heaps to be eaten by wild animals or exposed to the elements. And this is essentially a form of eugenics, which is basically the idea that by excluding groups or people judged to be inferior and promoting those judged to be superior, you can improve the genetic quality of a group of people. Now, 100 years ago, this idea of eugenics was pretty popular in the U.S. Proponents of eugenics fought for groups that they deemed undesirable to have access to contraceptives and abortion so that those undesirable groups would basically stop reproducing. Seneca the Younger, who was a Roman philosopher born around 4 BC and died around 65 AD, so he would have been just a little bit older than the Apostle Paul, but died right around the same time that the Apostle Paul did. Seneca the Younger promoted much the same idea. He says this: "We put down mad dogs, we kill the wild, untamed ox. We use the knife on sick sheep to stop their infecting the flock. We destroy abnormal offspring at birth. Children, too, if they are born weak or deformed, we drown. Yet this is not the work of anger, but of reason, to separate the sound from the worthless." And Greek philosophers Plato and Aristotle both supported these ideas hundreds of years before Seneca. Now, Jesus came into this world and upheld the dignity of women. He welcomed children. He loved the poor and protected and embraced the sick. I can't help but find it ironic that when someone like John Lennon sings about a universal brotherhood of man, he failed to see how that idea is being fulfilled in Jesus Christ, in whom there is no longer Jew or Greek, there's no longer slave or free, there is no longer male or female, for all are one in Christ Jesus. Now, this issue of universal human rights actually drove one Oxford University-trained scholar to search for deeper answers. A woman named Sarah Irving Stonebreaker is a friend of Rebecca McLaughlin, the author of Confronting Christianity, 12 Hard Questions for the World's Largest Religion, the book that we've been working through the last few weeks. Irving Stonebreaker was an atheist when she met McLaughlin in college, and like many atheists, she adamantly affirmed that all humans had intrinsic value as much as she adamantly rejected most of the claims of religions. But after listening to lectures from atheist philosopher Peter Singer, a professor at Princeton, she found that not all of her fellow atheists believed what she believed about the universal value of human life. According to Singer, animals or humans should be valued according to their capacities of self-awareness or their ability to suffer and show empathy and so on. If you track this line of reasoning through to its logical conclusion, it comes as no surprise that Singer believes a week-old baby is less valuable than a fully grown dog or pig. According to him, a week-old baby is not a rational and self-conscious being. There are many non-human animals whose rationality, self-consciousness, awareness, capacity, and so on exceed that of a human baby a week or a month old. Now, in an article that she published with the Veritas Forum titled How Oxford and Peter Singer Drove Me from Atheism to Jesus, Sarah Irving Stonebreaker later recalled, "I remember leaving Singer's lectures with a strange intellectual vertigo. I was committed to believing that universal human value was more than just a well-meaning conceit of liberalism." And here I think it's important to note that she's using this term liberalism in the technical, historical sense, which refers to a political and moral philosophy rooted in individual liberties, not how folks tend to use liberal as opposed to conservative today. She continues, "But I knew from my own research in the history of European empires and their encounters with indigenous cultures that societies have always had different conceptions of human worth, or lack thereof. The premise of human equality is not a self-evident truth. It is profoundly historically contingent. I began to realize that the implications of my atheism were incompatible with almost every value I held dear." Sarah's story is an honest one. What she felt to be true wasn't actually supported by what she thought was true. The things she desperately believed to be true about the universal dignity and value of human beings, she realized that her atheism really provided no foundation for those things to be true. All along, her belief in the universal value of humans was actually grounded in the teachings of Jesus. And so to answer this question, doesn't religion hinder morality? I think we can safely say religion does not hinder morality. Now, first we have to be careful about what we mean when we say religion, because clearly not all religions are the same. I think it's also fair to say that some religions do allow for some pretty horrific treatment of others, and other religions affirm the universal value of human life. Jesus certainly did. It's also important to keep in mind that not all atheists are moral monsters. Many atheists have a deep and genuine concern for the weak and vulnerable, just like Jesus did. But I don't think atheism can really support those values when pushed to its logical conclusion. In atheist systems which deny universal truths, morality simply becomes a preference or a pragmatic way to live. It is more advantageous for greater numbers of people if they live harmoniously, so therefore you should live peacefully with each other. This becomes a real problem, though, when 51% of the population decides that living peacefully means that they take from or oppress the other 49% of the population. On the other hand, I think Rebecca McLaughlin states the problem pretty well. She says this: today's secular humanism offers a worldview in which morality and reality are at odds. Human beings are a collection of atoms laboring under a false belief that they are even moral agents or that they're capable of making moral decisions. And yet humans are of immense, equal, and inalienable worth. The bottom line is you really can't have it both ways. So let me encourage you then, as we finish up this class this morning, let me encourage you to examine the person of Jesus. Take a close look at how he treated the weak and the vulnerable, how he talked with men and women and children, how he showed kindness to the outcast, how he embraced the sick, how he spoke respectfully to and about people of different cultures and different ethnicities, and how he was also unimpressed with any type of pretense that anybody might try to show. I can read about and teach all of these great points, but none of this matters if those of you who are kind enough to watch this video at home aren't drawn to know Jesus anymore. Thank you all so much for tuning in this morning. I hope these videos have been valuable to you as we look at some of these tough questions that people sometimes bring up when we try to talk to them about why we believe what we believe, how we can believe there's a God, why we think that God's Son is Jesus, why Jesus was raised from the dead, and things like that. Let me encourage you that if you know somebody who has struggled with these types of questions or somebody who has raised these questions to you, please share these videos with them. If they're interested in talking more about this, I'm happy to sit and talk with them. I'm happy to message with them. And I'm happy to recommend some things that they might be interested in reading if they're willing to do so. Guys, thank you again for joining us this morning. Stay safe, stay healthy, and hopefully we'll get to see each other again soon. Bye-bye.